Hey guys, Logan here from Popular Woodworking Magazine. Welcome to our new shop. So we are pretty much 75–80% of the way done with this new shop where we're bringing all of our photos and video for Popwood Magazine and popularwoodworking.com. And we're getting to a point where we're having people come and visit the shop and kind of see what we have going on. We've been talking about this new shop for a long time. And one of the things I'm finding a lot of people are saying immediately when they walk in is, wow, we really like this floor. So I wanted to do a video on the floor that we chose to do in here because I think a lot of us have a shop either in a garage or a basement, maybe a shed, and we have a concrete floor. But that doesn't mean the floor has to look like concrete. So when we were planning and designing this shop space to move all of our photography into, I knew I wanted to do something a little bit different on the floor. So what I chose to do was a HD Pro 2-part epoxy system from Spartan Epoxy. Now this is a DIY kit, and myself with a couple of the guys from the office, Phil and John, we went ahead and applied this flooring in pretty much a day. I mean, we did the first coat in a couple of hours, then just a couple more hours of work to do the rest of it. And it looks really, really nice, and there's a couple of benefits to it that I'll touch on in a bit. But first I'm going to walk through the process of applying this floor. So with any 2-part epoxy, you're going to want to prep the concrete surface. You can do that either with mechanical grinding using a grinding machine, or you can do it with an acid etch. And I chose to do an acid etch just because this was a fairly fresh slab. It was down for about 4 months before we applied the epoxy. So the acid wash is basically a muriatic wash that you apply to the floor. You let it etch the floor for a few minutes and you wash it off, and you wash it multiple times with water. Now I didn't film any of that because I didn't really want video equipment in here with all those muriatic fumes. There's a lot of fumes and you have respirators on and it was hot and stuff, so I just didn't really worry myself about filming that. But after that was done, you can check the floor out and make sure it's ready for epoxy. You do that with a water test. Splash a little bit of water on the floor, and you want it to absorb, kind of like getting water on your t-shirt. It absorbs in, it doesn't beat up, it absorbs in, and that's what you want the floor. So then it was time to apply the epoxy. Now it's a 2-part epoxy from Spartan. It's their HD Pro 2-part epoxy flooring system. And this is a 2-part epoxy that you mix up in batches and you work in little sections at a time. We did probably about 200 square feet at a time. This is approximately a 1,600 square foot shop. So we did several different little batches of it. And you mix it up for several minutes, then you dump it on the floor and you squeegee it out. And as you're squeegeeing it out, you're applying a back roller to it. So you're kind of smoothing it out with the roller, much like you would paint. And then here's where it's a little different depending on what you want to do. We chose to do a full flake coverage on this. So the epoxy itself was a gray, but on top of it, we did a flake of vinyl chips. And instead of doing bigger chips kind of sporadically spread out, we went ahead and did 100% coverage of a very fine flake. It's like a 1/16 of an inch flake. So it has a really cool speckled kind of granite type look to it. So after we applied the epoxy and rolled it out, I walked around with a bucket of flake and I just started broadcasting it on. And you're throwing it on for several minutes and making sure you have complete coverage on the floor. And as you're doing this, you're kind of doing it like you're feeding chickens. You're carrying the bucket, you're tossing the flake in the air and letting it kind of scatter randomly throughout the floor. Because this is a mixture of colors, you want to make sure they're nice and mixed. So this entire floor we did probably in a couple of hours, and it was about 350 pounds of flake that we put down. So after the flake is down, you kind of get off of it and you let it cure overnight. Then you come back and scrape off the top layer, vacuum that up, and you get all that loose flake off. And then you come back over top with a clear coat, and we chose to do a matte clear coat on this. Now it's nice, really low sheen, which I wanted for photos and video in here. A higher gloss might be a little bit easier to clean, but I do like this matte look. So the clear coat itself is a 2-part, very much like the epoxy base is. And if you want to add any non-slip stuff in there, you can do that. Because we chose to do a full flake coverage, this actually has quite a bit of texture. And if you reach down and feel this floor, you can kind of tell that it's somewhat like 80 grit sandpaper, which I actually really wanted on this floor. If you've ever been on an epoxy floor that has a little bit of sawdust on it or a little bit of water on it, that super high gloss, very sparsely flaked floor can get really, really slick. And even though we have a dust collection system in here and the plan is to tackle dust collection the best we can, I know that there's going to be sawdust on this floor. So I wanted that non-slip surface, which is why I chose to do the 100% flake coverage. But if I was doing something a little bit sparser with predominantly a color with a very minimally broadcast flake, I would have added that non-slip grit inside of there. But the top coat's just rolled on. There's a certain coverage that Spartan gives depending on which top coat you have, and you roll it on based on those and you let it dry about 12 hours before you walk on it. I think it's a couple of days for a solid cure time on that. Now there are a couple of things that we chose to do on this floor that maybe go against the manufacturer's suggestion, but we chose to do that for a couple of reasons. The first is the saw cuts in the floor. We did go ahead and leave our saw cuts in the floor. You can fill those. If you fill those, generally you want to do that a couple of days beforehand with a urethane type filler. We left the saw cuts in here. We rolled right over top. I don't mind seeing the cuts, but if you want a nice, clean, kind of a show floor, that is what you would want to do. We chose not to do that, and I think it looks great. Another thing that we chose to do is add a second layer of top coat. That's just to build up a little bit smoother of a finish than that first top coat gave us on the 100% flake coverage, just to cause this to sweep up a little bit easier. Now, the floor, even though it's 100% flake and it does have kind of a gritty texture, it sweeps up fairly easily. Now, a stiff bristle broom I found works the best for this, but if you really want to get all the dust off the floor, I've just been using my shop vac with a bristle brush, and that works really well. And I've been extremely happy with how this floor is held up, just moving stuff in and out and kind of working on the shop over the last several months. It seems to be holding up extremely well. One thing that I really like about it also is that it is a semi-soft floor. And what I mean by that is by having those layers of flake on top of the epoxy, it's a much softer feel than concrete is. And that's something that the guys at Spartan told me as I was working with them to figure out what floor we wanted. They said 100% flake coverage will lead to a little bit softer floor. So if you drop a tool, yeah, you're dropping it on an epoxy coated concrete floor, but the floor itself has a little bit more shock absorption and it's a little bit softer than just straight concrete. And I'm also finding that any spilled finishes on this floor are cleaning up really, really nicely. The walls in here, for example, are alder, and I'm finishing them with a Danish oil. It's just a curing oil, has a little bit of varnish in it. And with this floor, I've been able to just soak those with a little bit of mineral spirits and then use a soft bristle brass brush, and it scrubs right off and it doesn't touch the floor, which is really nice. Something with a film finish like that Danish oil is cleaning up extremely easily. Now, of course, this is still a concrete floor with epoxy over top. So there are a couple of areas where you may want to add a little bit of extra cushion. So let's go ahead and head over to the bench. I'm going to show you a couple of options that I use in my shop, and one that I think you may not have heard of, but is a really good option. So before we talk about individual kind of task flooring options, I do want to mention one thing, because when we were planning on building this shop, a lot of people had suggestions of a lot of different things, but one of the flooring suggestions we had, and a lot of people talked about, was running sleepers in a subfloor. And what I mean by that is having a concrete floor poured like we did, but then laying either 2x4s or 2x6s down on their face and applying a subfloor over the top of the concrete floor. Now this does a couple of things, and I think there is a benefit here. Mainly what it does is it gives you space between the concrete floor and the subfloor. That means you can run stuff like dust collection, electrical, you can run a lot of stuff into the floor that is otherwise either in the walls or buried in concrete, where you don't have to do that here. The other thing that it does is it creates a much softer floor. Because you're standing on wood then, instead of concrete, it has a little bit of spring and it's just easier on your feet and knees. However, with a large space, this does add quite a lot of cost to it. You know, the subfloor and the 2x4s aren't that much, but when you start talking about maybe adding a hardwood floor on top of this, that's when it really adds up. And the other reason that I didn't really want to go this route was that we have in-floor heat here. So there's radiant tubes in the floor that are going to heat up the concrete and heat this during the winter. I mean, we are in Iowa, it gets cold. So I didn't want any thermal barrier here. By creating this airspace and having the wood down there, the surface that you're standing on just becomes a little bit insulated from the heated floor. And I just wanted to avoid that completely, which is why we chose to do the epoxy floor. Now let's talk a little bit about kind of area-specific flooring options in your shop. Now, I know a lot of people will use something like a horse mat, and that's great. Those are big, heavy-duty rubber mats that you can stand on. They add a little bit of spring. They help you kind of alleviate some of that pain in your feet and knees. The one thing that I really like to use, and somehow we have a ton of these, is old yoga mats. My wife's ordered several of these, and she orders a new one every couple of years, so I get the ones that she is not using anymore. And I like these because they're fairly large, so they'll actually cover a majority of the area in front of the workbench or the table saw. Even at the lathe, I can put one of these down, and they work really well. They add just a little bit of cushion to the floor. Even though this vinyl chip flooring is fairly squishy by itself, this adds even more, and they're lightweight. Some of the dedicated woodworking mats and stuff, they get kind of heavy, especially if it's a big like weightlifting mat or something like that. They get really heavy. Now here is one other option that is kind of different, but it's kind of an old school mat option that machinists used to use. This is a slat floor. So what this guy is, this one happens to be made out of Ipe. If I wanted something a little softer, I would probably choose something like fir pine or maybe soft maple. But all this is a slat that is made out of a couple of strips that are half-lapped into other strips on the top. And what this does is it creates a raised surface that is actually squishy. Because these are spaced out, maybe 16 inches apart, as you stand on it, they flex a little bit. Now the Ipe is fairly firm, so using a softer wood would make them even squishier as you stand on them. And you can make these as big as you want. 3 by 6 was a fairly common size in machine shops. And machinists used to use these a lot for a couple of reasons. They're on their feet all the time. They want something softer to stand on than concrete floor. But they also allow chips, metal shavings, and oil to fall down through them onto the concrete floor. So you're not standing in oil and chips all day long. And then at the end of the day, they're lightweight. You pick them up, stand them up against the wall, and you can sweep up the floor and lay these back down. So it's another good option if you want to make something like this for your shop. So if you're working in your shop and you're looking around and thinking, oh, you know what? I love my shop, but my floor could use a little bit of work. Go and consider an epoxy floor. It adds a great look to the shop, and I think it'll make your space a little bit better to work in.